the next topic is about this concept called island biogeography. And island biogeography is an idea about how biodiversity of islands or island-like systems is impacted by different factors. It talks about the relationships and the distribution of organisms living on islands or island-like pieces of habitat. Island biogeography was a concept that was studied by famous scientists E.O. Wilson and Robert MacArthur at Princeton University, the late 1960s. And one of the experiments that's kind of interesting that Wilson did with graduate students was he experimented in the Florida Keys, where you have a whole series of relatively small islands. And they would, in this experiment, they would fumigate these islands. You can see that happening here with a compound that would kill all arthropods. And they would do this to several islands, and then they would categorize how species colonized these islands that were all arthropods were removed from. And this helped them to formulate their concept of island biogeography. And island biogeography says that there's two really important factors that dictate the colonization of islands by organisms from a mainland source. First, the size of the island. The larger the island will typically have more species, have a higher biodiversity. And the closer an island is to a source of colonizing species, the greater the biodiversity. So a larger island and an island closer to the source of species will have higher biodiversity than a farther and smaller island. So we can see here a little bit of some data about the number of different plant species on an island, that as the size of the island increases, the species diversity of plants on that island also tends to increase. And we see this in reality, this concept of island biogeography throughout the world, when we have islands or groups of islands that have been colonized by species from other areas. And we can see, for example, the Galapagos Islands, which species from the mainland of South America colonized these Galapagos Islands. But different islands have different levels of biodiversity that are based upon some of these factors that we just talked about: size of the island, distance from a source of species colonization. We also know that many times on islands there are relatively unique specialist species that evolve on these islands because they have limited resources. Often they have pretty narrow niches, that these islands often have present species that are uniquely adapted to conditions on these islands. For example, the Galapagos finches that are found in the Galapagos Islands, there's a wide variety of these finches. They all evolved from a mainland species that at one point migrated to the Galapagos. And then because conditions on these various islands are different, the species evolved and speciated into many different species, each with unique adaptations to the conditions on these various islands. Since Wilson and MacArthur's work, however, the idea of island biogeography has been expanded to not only apply to islands and water, but also to include what we call habitat islands. Habitat islands are areas of habitat that are isolated from other parts of the habitat. And so, for example, if we take a contiguous piece of forest habitat, and because of development or other reasons it gets fragmented, we could consider these fragments actually as islands of habitat within an area. And so the concept of island biogeography applies not only to actual islands, but for example, parks within a city would be an island of habitat that's present in a given area. And the applicability of island biogeography has expanded since its original conception.